The criteria is they gave me 10 minutes to tell my life story. And I could keep you here for 10 days or 10 weeks. But my primary concern today is telling stories to these 4 children here that don't even know what an ice machine is. I've lived here since 1944. I've done so many things I can't even remember them. But I will never forget the story on the ice truck. And this little diagram, you can tell I'm an artist, but I did this so I could point out to the children later on more about the story. But approximately 1947 or 48, my father was working for the Allen Ice Company out in the ice field, driving the truck that loaded the trucks, flatbed trucks, that haul the ice to the warehouse. That night when I got home from basketball practice, Dad was sitting at this end of the table with an ashtray full of cigarette butts. My mother was at the other end of the table, still telling him why he should have never been out there. So I'm new to what the story was already been told. But what took place that day, Dad had agreed to help harvest the ice at the field in the lake. And he had a very uncomfortable feeling about it because number one, he couldn't swim a stroke. Number two, he knew there was a lot of open water there, so that had him concerned. So he was operating, there's a picture of it right up there, the original ice truck. They had the rack off the back so he could look out and see what was going on. But during the process of backing up and driving forward, he was holding the door open either with his hand or his foot because it was a shift truck. And eventually it happened. He was in the process of backing up. He heard a terrible crack. He felt the back seat of the truck leave his back, and he looked out and here's open water. He made one giant leap over that water, hit the ice, and he was the first one on the shoreline. Now this can be verified, except the guy that told me is now gone. But he was our janitor later at school, and I said, Hugo, I said, what do you remember about the day the accident took place? And he says, Donnie, the only thing I remember was the wind whistling through your dad's ears when he passed the rest of us. That kind of combines with the stories that Dad told. But after this took place, the truck went to the bottom of the lake, and for years it could not be found. And when the scuba divers finally found it, they wouldn't tell where it was at because Dad had offered a considerable sum to have it brought up and restored for this museum right here. The truck is still there. It's a little bit of rusty metal is about all that's left. But after the accident took place, Dad decided to go back the next day. He had a little 41 Ford truck. They put chains on it. He went back, but this time they put the truck where it was supposed to be, because on the day that the accident took place, this here area was the field where the ice was being cut from. And it would be pushed with pike poles up here to this channel. The truck would back up. They would drop a harness over the back of 3 or 4 or 5 blocks of ice. And then the truck would drive up here and pull these ice chutes up it was kind of like a ramp. Pull them up that ramp, and then they would land in the back of this truck and they'd drive away. And there was quite a number of trucks, I don't remember how many, that they have, so that was a fast operation. Dad had just backed up and was starting his forward progress, and that crack was a big crack from there down to here, and this piece of ice tipped up, the truck slid off, that ice came back up, and you could walk on it. The next day, when Dad came back with the pickup, from then on, he was on this side where they should have been to start with. But for years, this is the way it operated. But that particular year, 2 foot of ice, 22, 24 inches, something like that. There was enough stress somewhere, or there could have been a crack from the ice heaving and growing that it does as it gets thicker in depth. But these different fellas that were all out here all had specific jobs. The ice harvest started here. It was scored with a gasoline engine with a big disc wheel, saw blade like they use in ice harvesting, or I mean in wood harvesting, where you run it through the sawmill. Then, after they get that scoring done on it, they had to keep it so that the water didn't get back into this crack, so it'd freeze up solid again. So with that crack being there, the lines were cut this way. They could take the ice chisel, which, this is the chisel right here, and sometimes they used a needle bar, but you could drive that like an ice pick into that crack, and that would just shear that block of ice off just as nice and neat as if it had been sawed all the way. Then they would haul it to the trucks. The truck would, this street is at the west end of the roller coaster, and at that time there was a ramp here where the trucks could drive right over the sidewalk down onto the lake shore, over, get loaded, come back up, and the ice house was up here where the current water tower is for the town of Arnold's Park. Once this operation was done, when they went back, got to the ice house, the storing of the ice, that was a project that was probably as back-breaking as anything could be, because to start with, the lower level of the ice house was below ground, and then that was all covered with sawdust. The truck would back up to a chute at the side of the ice house, and they would push those big ice blocks off the back of the truck and down this chute, and then 2 men would grab it with this set of tongs right here, and they would drag it over that sawdust to get to the back. Once that was done, guys would run around, there were several of them, and they'd take a shaver like this and smooth that out so that the floor of the ice itself was as level as possible. Then, when the next row started to fill the ice house up, when that block came down off the back of the truck and hit that floor of ice, there was a guy standing there with this hook right here, and he would take that, bring it down, and drive this point into the front corner of that block of ice, give it a whip like that. That would start rotating like this, and when I started doing that, after the guy taught me how to do it, from this wall to that back corner is very close to the distance from where the truck was unloaded to where they started stacking the next row. And when that was done properly, that 300-pound block of ice twirling like that was just like going across a skating rink or a dance floor. And there would be a number of guys over there, and if it ever stopped, there was always enough moisture formed from that rotating action that if it stopped, it would stick. And once it stuck, you had to work hard. So everything was on a running basis. But once it was back to the corner, there'd be, I think there was 3 or 4 fellas that had a set of tongs, more like this short pair down here. They would grab it and run it right over to the position it was in. And the next set of guys took this one right here, this was the most popular tool in the ice house at that time, but they would take this tool and grab that block of ice and tip it up from the widest edge to the narrow, and they'd have that pushed tight against the next row. Now the first row on the outside of the stacking process, they left an area of 6, 8, 10 inches, something like that, between that row of ice and the wall of the ice house. And once that had, say, 2 layers of ice, other fellows would come with it was a metal bushel basket full of sawdust, and they would start filling that between the ice and the sidewall completely around. That was kept up until you got up to the point where some cases, if they needed all the ice they could get, the fellows were working like this, bent over. They would get that ice that high up in that building. And the sidewalls were probably pretty close to what this room is right here. So that'd give you an idea how much ice they put away to take care of the town of Arnold's Park at that time. Then, once the harvesting was done, a complete layer of sawdust was put over the whole room full of ice. And it's been proven fact in Minnesota, Canada, places like that, there's been ice houses that has been uncovered with ice that has been there in more years than some people could remember. It would stay together as a chunk. Now, once the process was done, then the Allen family took over, and they would drag those 300-pound blocks of ice to the front and score it again, cut it into approximately 3 pieces, load it in the trucks, and take off, and they'd make the route. In the route, when they were delivering to homes, there would be a card in the window, and whoever lived there would have a card that was 25 or 50 pounds, depending on their icebox size. So the iceman knew just how big a chunk to take to that home to put in the icebox to last until several days later when they deliver again. Now I'm going to backtrack, because my own personal experience when I was in high school, I helped in the ice field on East Okoboji where the McKinney family had the ice business. And in that operation, it was done basically the same way, except when it got to the shoreline, instead of putting it on trucks, it went up and I'm going to call it like an escalator, where they loaded box cars full of ice that was shipped to like Chicago or big city places. Your railroads required quite a bit of ice. Your packing plants at that time required quite a bit of ice because they used it in box cars when they were shipping box cars, quarters and halves of beef and so on. In this area we were fortunate because the lake ice was a premium not only for availability but for quality and cleanliness. And I can remember being this size, and there's nothing better than to be able to talk the iceman into giving you a few chips off the back of the truck to suck on and chew on, and hopefully leave you a little when they drove away. So that business was, it was family income at a time when there was really no work available, because in the winter things just dried up. And the guys that worked the ice field and in the houses earned every penny they made, and they got paid by the penny, really. It depended on how much ice they could get put away to keep that business surviving from year to year. I'm trying to think of something that Mary wanted me to enlighten you on.
Let's just ask if there's questions. Yeah, we do have the video yet also.
All right, there's a question in the back here.
What was the time of the year that the truck went in?
Probably, well, I'll put it this way. They had to wait till it got to 12, 16 inches, but from 16 inches to 24 inches was what they liked the best, because you got a 24-inch depth, 24 inches wide, and most of those blocks were right at 3 foot to maybe 3.5 foot long. But they basically run about 300 pounds per block when they were brought up off the lake.
When they scored it in the lake, how deep down did they go with the scoring?
Well, as I remember, the saw blade on the one that the Allen Ice Company used, I'm guessing that blade was right at 30 inches in diameter. And they would basically run that about as deep as they could, but they didn't want water to get back in there, and they would stuff the cracks at the end with snow packet so that they could have a row or two ready to go the first thing in the morning. And a couple of guys had to work the field late at night. They would take a pike pole, kind of like this hook here, where they could push with it or pull with it, and they would walk the channel and walk the open water, pushing a block of ice around to keep it from freezing, because all it takes is a ½ inch of ice and you were in trouble, because it would be that difficult to get through. But once they got, even if it got a thin skin on it, they could keep it open by moving it around with a pike pole like that. In that process, there's a set of cleats in here that every worker in the field and in the house was issued a pair of cleats like this. And of course, we all wore 4-buckle overshoes, tried to stay high and dry, because you didn't have to worry about getting cold putting up ice. You had to worry about sweating too much. But with these studs on here, and you can see how that was hinged, this would go over your toe, this hooked around your heel, and it gave you the traction you need. Weren't a good object to try to dance in. Just didn't work too well. So the fellas at the end of the day, when they went home, they were beat, anxious and thankful to have the work, and ready to go the next morning. I never heard of anybody ever reporting to work late, because everybody appreciated the fact that they had an opportunity to make some extra money to get through the winter.
Don, about how much would someone who's doing the harvesting like you were make in a day?
Dollars and cents wise,
Yeah.
I don't know, but I don't think I made over 50 cents an hour working in the McKinney ice field. That day that I helped over there, the McKinney family drove across to our property at the resort where the Ritz is now. That was our family resort for 22 years. And that was the best access for them to get their equipment onto East Okoboji. So I was fortunate enough to be able to pick up a few hours work. And my job that particular day, on the channel, they had a little ramp across that, and you stood on that 2 pieces of plank with like the shaver here, only it was a needle bar, and it was just a straight shaft with a real sharp point. And as these blocks would float by, there'd be 3 or 4 of them together. And when you got to that scour or scoring, you drive that needle bar right down that, just snap that big chunk of ice into one big block. And then it would go up the elevator to the box cars. I was fortunate enough, the bar that I was using that day had a handle on it, kind of like this one, just a steel handle. But the guy that was working ahead of me, his bar that he had was just a straight shaft needle bar. And he said to me, he said, "Now, Donnie, be careful," because he says, the last one, he says, still in the bottom of the lake, he says, "I'm sure it went right on through," because it slid through his mittens, and they had to bring him out another ice pick to break those apart as they were going up the channel.
How old were you then?
What?
So in other words, with that McKinney, with that property where you had that, and you said boxcars, so the railroad was right there at one time, right next to that, load those boxcars.
The Milwaukee Road from
Yeah.
Spencer to Spirit Lake, there was 2 sidings that I know of. The one in Okoboji was used strictly for loading ice in the wintertime. The one in Arnold's Park had a siding where they would bring in freight, boxcar or flat, the open car that didn't have a top on it. They'd bring in loads of coal for the lumber yards, and they'd unload off those sidings. And thankfully, that was one job I never inherited, because the poor guys that did the unloading of the coal would reach in and grab one, how much they weighed, I'm gonna guess 30 or 40 pounds, up over the side, and hopefully it landed either into the wagon or the truck box where it would be hauled to the lumber yards where they sold the coal.
Where do they get all the sawdust?
There was a sawmill at Sawmill Bridge, but they had arrangements at some of the big sawmills that cut the big trunks into planking, and they would bring that in by the truckload, and it was piled in just in the yard right outside the ice house. I can remember that being up all the way the side of the building, which would have been 8-10 foot tall, probably 30 or 40 foot. And I don't remember how far it stretched out into the yard. And that was all carried back in those little metal bushel baskets. A lot of back work. There's some of the way back.
How did they, when you're getting up there quite a ways in the ice house, how did they get the blocks up that high? And also how did they get the sawdust up there?
Brute force. But here again, this long-handled one, when you had the uphill climb, be 2 guys, one on each side, and they would walk in those 300-pound blocks up that wooden ramp. Once it was to the top, why a lot of times they had to drag it all the way to the back, because if they hesitated for a minute where that would stick, then you couldn't grab it with this to give it that twirl. Hard work.
How long would all that ice last, or how far into the summer would the ice be available?
A lot of times there was 2 or 3 rows left after the summer was over. And this is what they tried, they hoped they always got down to so that there was just one level left, because then all they had to do is scrape the sawdust off, and when the first load came for the next winter's harvesting, when it hit that ice, well, you could give it the twirl. And there's tricks to all trades, and that was one of the things that helped save the back, so when you could keep it moving.
How many ice companies were in just the Lakes area, and did they harvest out of Big Spirit? We talked a lot about the Okoboji.
I can't tell you for sure, because the 2 that I knew personally, I know that there was one here in Spirit Lake that my grandpa and grandma got ice from, but I don't remember the location. And I know Milford had a big one where they loaded out on the south end of West Okoboji. Big Spirit got their ice from Big Spirit.
What year did the truck go in?
Pardon?
What year was that? Did you say 46 or 47?
It was 47 or 48 when the truck went through the ice. It's still in the bottom of the lake, yes.
Do you know how long the Allens had been doing it prior to you coming to the lake?
Woody Allen was an old timer, and I think there was maybe a generation before him. But when we moved here, Woody was an old man, retired, probably 60, 65 years old, and he'd done it most of his life. And I think the last harvest was in the early 50s, because that was the year that I know it was after I was married that I worked there the last year they were in operation. I'm going to say 54 or 5, something like that. Bob might know for sure, because when they closed it out, he helped get rid of some of the trucks.
Can you relate any other instances where somebody slipped in?
There was always an exception where somebody might have gotten wet, but here again, I think was a good example of humankind being able to walk on water, because nobody wanted to be in up to here. So if someone got close to going under, why, they're pretty darn careful, because that water's awful cold.
Sure.
Is there any, I think Mary said there is an old ice house behind the barn swallows up. They special construction to an ice house, and then when they unloaded it, did they use any mechanical, could they have a rail system like the barns or something, or was it slide it again down a chute?
Manpower.
Okay.
That's all I ever saw. In fact, the elevator in Okoboji where they loaded the boxcars, I don't even remember how they got that out, because it went down underwater, so you floated that block of ice up to it, and it was like the elevator on the farm taking the ear corn up and dropping it in the corn cribs.
So was there sawdust between each layer of ice so that they didn't stick together, or?
Nope.
Nope?
Nope.
So how,
All the sawdust was on that, pardon?
how'd they keep each row from sticking to the one before it?
They didn't, but you see, when it was on the narrow side, here's 2 blocks of ice, one here and one here, and there's sometimes touching, sometimes there's a gap, but if they were stuck to the bottom, here again, either this tool or the tall one back here was used to, I'm going to say, jar it loose, because once you hit it just right, it'll shatter like a piece of glass, and you can get it moving again.
I
you probably already covered this, but who actually invented the idea of cutting ice?
Probably some Indian. It was something that was a need at that time. I know personally, my relatives that lived on a farm that didn't have electricity, they didn't have ice boxes, they hung what they could in a metal bucket down into the well to a certain level to just keep it chilled, and you could keep milk and cream for quite a number of days because it was cool enough.
So that the truck was in Smith's Bay, right?
Actually, the old roof garden, it was out in, approximately in front of that, because where the state pier is here now, right here was the state pier, and this area is where Berkeley Park is now in honor of Berkeley Bedell. And this is the old roof garden that was up along the lake shore. The traffic, this was an open street all the way along over to the west end of the, you could drive the whole lake shore at that time. And when the truck went in, it was facing this way. Chipped up, slid off, and went to the bottom. Could not be found for several years because right away in the spring it's clear out there and you can see, but the minute vegetation starts to show up, you don't see much of anything. But Jim Jackson was a plumber in Spirit Lake at that time and a flyer, and he could spot that ice truck coming and going to the Okoboji Airport. So he had a good idea location-wise where it was. And they found out that it was approximately maybe 1 to 2 blocks away from where it actually went in. And the first theory was Dad forgot to turn the engine off, so it kept running. But you think about an inner tube full of air. There's 6 big truck tires full of air. There was a wooden box, so it had flotation encouragement. And out of all the conversation we had, and I didn't come up with this, someone else thought about it, but where the Queen backs out now, when they back out from the shoreline and back towards the grade, and then they go ahead to do their tour. Then when they come back, they circle along Des Moines Beach, and at that time, they were going almost directly over where the truck was. And the theory that makes sense to me was that first summer, there was enough flotation there that the wash from that big prop on the Queen probably encouraged that truck to drift. Because in one of the articles, I'm trying to think of the name of the guy that was the underwater diver that had an article on it. According to what he said, the truck was actually kind of facing northwest, where it should have been facing almost straight north and south when it went in. So that theory that wash from the Queen probably encouraged the relocating of the truck.
Is that Tom Tour, Bill?
Pardon?
Is that gentleman's name Tom Tour, Bill?
No. Amundsen, I believe, is the name of the...
Lloyd Cunningham.
Lloyd
Cunningham, yep.
Well, let's go ahead, Don, if you're ready. We'll show this video of actual ice harvesting back in the day. We'll need to shut down the lights for this.
Where's it going to show at?
Donna, this is going to be bad in your eyes, I think.
Let me get out of the road. Nice cane. I like that.
Don, when you see just raise your hand and I'll stop the video.
Go ahead, fire away.
Here we go.
Now you can see how it's being loaded on the back of the truck there. The guy right there has got the pike pole, and those blocks were broke separately as they were brought out of the harvest field. Now, for the sake of those that don't know, those horses or mules, whatever they use for that, there's a horseshoe up here, and they had special cleats on those horses to give them footing so they wouldn't slip and slide quite as much. That saw blade right there now is an example of the scoring, and it looks like they're only going probably 6 or 8 inches. I think they call that manpower. The poor horses didn't get credit for it. That piece of metal that showed on the back of that block of ice, that was on the bottom of the lake there at one time. They retrieved that out, and there was a second one that was found on the back of the truck, if I'm not mistaken.
We will have this video showing out on the television screen out in the main entry room. Along with the clip of the ice harvest, there are clips of going down the toboggan slide at Spirit Lake and some other fun things too. They're all very short, but we'll have that running out in the other room.
That picture right there is what my grandparents' dock looked like, the Midway Resort, the day the airplane crashed into Big Spirit back in 41, 2 or 3, when Bob will tell you about that. But I got a picture of my grandpa standing on the dock at Midway because they didn't get it out before that storm hit.
Any other questions?
Did you harvest ice all winter?
No, that was a short operation. I'm going to say a week to 10 days was pretty much maximum. And from then on, it was run the selling and distribution. Alan, there was 3 boys in that family. They each had a truck for delivering. McKinney, I think, had a couple of trucks. And from then on, there wasn't near the number of people involved. 2 or 3 guys could handle the routes and get the ice delivered each day. I want to compliment these 4 here. They didn't interrupt me one time, and they were ladies and gentlemen. They were listening very attentively. And that's the main reason I'm here, because the rest of you should know something about ice boxes. All I know is when we had the antique and used furniture, thank you, honey. When we had the used furniture and antique business, a good oak wooden ice box was worth several $100s, and some of them later on got up into the thousands that people were paying for them to have set in their living room somewhere and talk about them.
So when the Iceman brought ice, did they bring it clear into the house, or did they have a metal box to put it in outside the door like?
No. That was, in most cases, some of the homes had the little ice tongs where they could do some of their own work, but the iceman basically brought it right to and put it in the ice box for you.
How big was an ice box? So like,
Some of them were just 2 doors in the front, opening on the top where they could set the, say, 50 pounds in there. 50-pound, I think, was the biggest box I can remember seeing. But there were some that had 3 and 4 doors, so they were probably 36 to 42 inches wide, where you could have put like 60, 75 pounds of ice in. At the resort, we had an underground, it was an old beer case that came out of a bar somewhere, but it was well insulated. So Dad dug a hole at the end of the boathouse, we buried that underground, and the truck would back up, and it was about 8 foot long and probably 2 foot wide, and they could stand a 2 foot tall piece of ice in there. And they would unload several hundred pounds of ice there at the resort for us every day or two, probably every 2 or 3 days, because fishermen at that time, there was more hungry people fishing than there were sportsmen returning them to the lake. So when people came in, it was not uncommon to see a boat come in with a 6-foot stringer full of bullheads. And I can remember a couple of our pictures that were destroyed in the 10-inch rain that we had on the 4th of July back in the 60s somewhere. I can remember several times farmer coming in and throwing that stringer of bullheads over their shoulder, and it would drag all the way to the car. When they got to the car, they put them in big round tubs and took them home, and the whole family was busy cleaning fish, because that was quite a day's supply of groceries.
Don, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.